Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Committee for Justice virtual panel discussion on COVID liability shields, shaping our legal system to withstand pandemic lawsuits. We have an exciting lineup of guests today. So first, we have Victor Schwartz, who is co-chair and of the Public Policy Practice Group at Shook, Harned, and Bacon. Victor Schwartz is a former professor and dean, co-chairs of the Public Policy Group at Shook, Harned, and Bacon. He is co-author of the most widely used torts casebook in the United States, Prosser, Wade, and Torts. He has been a principal advisor to the Restatement of Torts, third and twice named by the National Law Journal Restatement of Tort, and third and twice named by the National Law Journal as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. Mr. Schwartz has served in both Republican and Democratic administrations. Karen Harned serves as executive director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses Small Business Legal Center. Prior to joining the Legal Center in 2002, Ms. Harned was an attorney at Washington, D.C. law firm specializing in food and drug law, and also served as assistant press secretary to U.S. Senator John Nichols of Oklahoma. Ms. Harned received her BA from the University of Oklahoma and her JD from the George Washington University National Law Center. As executive director of the NFIB Small Business Legal Center, Ms. Harned comments regularly on small business cases before the federal and state courts, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. She has appeared on Fox News, Fox Business, NBC Nightly News, PBS NewsHour, among others. She also regularly testifies before Congress on civil procedure reform and other legal issues important to small business, including the Supreme Court nomination hearing of Justice Justice Neil Gorsuch. Sorry about it, Justice Neil Gorsuch. Yael Ossowski is a consumer advocate, writer, and radio host based in Vienna, Austria, and Charlotte, North Carolina. He currently is deputy director at the Consumer Choice Center and a contributor to Specialty magazine. He hosts Consumer Choice Radio on the Big Talker 106.7 FM out of Washington, D.C. every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. He is previously an investigative reporter at watchdog.org, serving Florida bureau chief and chief Spanish translator. From 2013 to 2020, Yael worked as a grassroots organizer and fundraiser for Students for Liberty. Yael has written and been syndicated in hundreds of publications globally, including the Chicago Tribune, Miami Herald, Austin American Statesman, Washington Examiner, Huffington Post, the Charlotte Observer, Arizona Capital Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Detroit News, Reason Magazine, American Spectator, the Gaston Gazette, FoxNews.com, and more. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. For the Q&A session, so what we're going to do here is the three panelists will present very briefly, about 7 to 8 minutes in the order in which they were introduced. And afterwards, we're going to have a discussion between myself and the three panelists, and we're going to have a question and answer session. As you can all see at the bottom of your screen, with the two little bubbles, there's the Q&A function. If instead of raising your hand, if you could send me questions through Q&A, we can do this at any point during the webinar. I will then introduce the questions after the discussion. It would be a lot easier just to write them out and send them to me. So that would make it easier for both ends here. And we're happy to answer as many questions as we have time for. And with that, Victor, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, and good afternoon. And it's an honor to be on the panel with Karen, who I've worked with on many occasions, and to see Yael. I've heard him on the radio, and he actually looks pretty good. A lot of people on the radio, when you see them, it's rather ghastly. So it's good to meet you both. When this pandemic started, a lawyer friend of mine, who's a very good plaintiff's lawyer, said, Victor, every death, every injury, and even where there isn't an injury, is a potential lawsuit. Now that's a mouthful, but the thinking of the plaintiffs' bar on this is very strong, very powerful, even though some consumer groups will say it's just a bluff and nothing's going to happen. Their thought has focused on just certain groups. One would be any type of premises, the type of businesses that that Karen monitors, but big box stores too. They rather sue Walmart than a mom and pop store. And the allegation there is that somebody was exposed at that place, then got the disease. The second are people who make personal protection equipment of any kind. Now, some of them, fortunately, those who make N95s, have garnered some protection at the federal level. but many have not. And it's easier sometimes to blame somebody who's trying to protect people than it is the actual wrongdoer, and those are two big groups. And finally, drug companies. But the drug companies with the vaccine have protection under something called the PrEP Act, but the plaintiffs' lawyers are working very hard to find loopholes in the PrEP Act. You have to prove, like reckless disregard, it's hard to prove, but those are some of the major ones. A minor one is very interesting, and that's just your neighbor suing you. You were in their house, you got the disease, and they're hopeful that the homeowner's insurance will cover it. Otherwise, they wouldn't sue. Propaganda. Unlike major product liability over the years, the plaintiffs' lawyers realize that advertising is not the proper road. What they're trying to do is make people think a little bit differently. It's not my fault, but it's somebody else's fault. It's hard to do with nature, but believe me, they're thinking about it, because unless a person feels that it's not her responsibility, they're not going to sue, and they cannot be collected as customers or clients. I think I'll stop right there and go on to the next speaker, so I reserve time for them.
Thank you, Victor. Karen?
Sorry, I forgot to mute myself. It's great to see everybody. Always good to be with you, Victor, and hear your words of wisdom on these important issues, because you are the oracle when it comes to torts and liability. So when we saw the COVID happen and then started to really think about it, we became very concerned at NFIB about what this is going to mean for small business. And it turns out our concerns were well-founded because our members are thinking the same way. Our research in early May shows that 70% of them are concerned about liability when it comes to reopening their business. And if you're like me, you're probably already seeing this with my nail salon, for example, having waivers that they're asking their customers to sign. So this is very top of mind, more than I'd say any other time in my 18 years at NFIB, where small business owners are really, really concerned about this. And when I'm talking about small business owners, NFIB, our average member has 10 employees or less. And that is, again, where we're drawing the 70% with concern over liability. I appreciate that the Walmarts and the big box stores are going to be very attractive initial targets. But what we have seen over the years with liability in small business, as Victor well knows, is there's the trial bar that you probably even see on TV, right? But then there's what I call the bottom feeders, and they are lawyers that they'll just create a little cottage industry around a type of lawsuit that they want to file. So we have seen this in the Americans with Disabilities Act, where we literally have attorneys using drones or sending in the same plaintiff to 20 businesses during a day, threatening to file a lawsuit if a guardrail is 25 inches or a quarter of an inch off where it should be, and saying, if you don't pay us $10,000 in 15 days, we're going to file a lawsuit. And they get much success out of that. They get a lot of little settlements, but it's enough to make the money for that trial lawyer. We've seen it in the Telephone Communication Protection Act. We've seen it in a number of different areas where it's literally a tool to extort the small business owner. And our concern is that because COVID is so hard to identify where you caught it, right? Still, even with the information we have today, I think that would very much be the case. So you go into a restaurant, you find out you get COVID, you remember going in that restaurant and thinking maybe the tables were a little too close or something. You measure, were they 6 feet apart? Well, no, they were 5.5 feet apart. Now we're going to sue. It could be all sorts of different things that I haven't even thought of. And the concern also is it could be like asbestos has been, which 20 years ago, I think they thought these lawsuits would be concluded. And here we are still having them filed day after day today. I'm very concerned that this can be a living lawsuit for quite many years to come. And for that reason, we have been pushing very hard at the state and federal level for liability protections. We're definitely seeing activity at the state level. Ohio just passed a good measure, and many states to date have done a good job on that. But at the federal level, not surprisingly, it's complete stagnation. But I guess what I would just leave it for people to think about when it comes to the small business community before I hand off is, $5,000 to $10,000 for them, even $1,500, quite frankly, is a lot, especially when they are struggling right now to get back in business. And they're looking at, best case sales in the 50 to 75% of what they were seeing this time last year. And so, I should note that in Senator McConnell's federal legislation, I thought really, and I'd be curious what Victor's thoughts on this, but I thought he did a nice job of really trying to target and disincentivize these gotcha lawsuits that I'm talking about, where it's just an extortionate type of deal. The only other thing I would note is, one of the things that people are saying as far as, we'll have a safe harbor, as long as you do everything CDC says, or everything a local or state government says, you should be good to go. Well, I think there needs to be a little grace there, because there's a lot of inconsistency between the different standards at the local, state, and federal levels. And what makes sense as far as protocols at a 5-person auto repair shop is quite different than a restaurant that seats 100. And with that, I will hand it off.
Thank you. Yael?
All right, thank you, and great to be with esteemed panelists here. I'm not a lawyer or a businessman, but just a small consumer advocate. So great to put in a different perspective. When we started looking at this and figuring out that coronavirus was not only going to be something for public health, but something that would enter the legal area, that was obviously something that's going to impact consumers. So that's what we started to focus on at Consumer Choice Center. And when I started looking at the numbers, I saw that there's already been 2,400 cases or lawsuits, and that was just between the months of March and May, that were filed with some kind of coronavirus connection, usually against businesses or schools or something where people have felt that they caught the virus. And that's where, for consumers specifically, whenever we're now opening back up, hopefully our economies will maybe pop back into shape. A lot of people might be concerned when they're going out to different businesses, when they're putting their kids back in school, when they're going back to work. And one large measure of clarity is knowing that people are taking responsible sort of guidelines and they're implementing them into the place of business, into schools, or whatever it might be. And I think the idea of a liability waiver is incredibly important for that, because if you're following the rules, if you're not negligent and you're doing everything that has been provided for in the guidelines, you should not be at the mercy of the very large army of lawyers that are ready to pounce and sue. As Karen mentioned, if a table happens to be 6 inches a certain way, or there's a particular mask rule that's not being followed. There are so many great businesses that are actually taking these measures into account. It's something that's scaled up very well with many larger companies. Anyone who's ever been to an Apple store in the last couple of months, and I've been to a few in several countries now, and every single time it's the same procedure, it's the same rules, they're uniform, and they're able to do that at scale. And it's the same if you go down to your local Trader Joe's, and it's the same if you go to any pharmacies. Many of these businesses took voluntary measures following the guidelines of the CDC, and in that way, they've provided the avenue to keep their customers and consumers safe. And it's something that consumers, I believe, can have a lot of confidence in. So the idea that there's going to be a wave of lawsuits is definitely going to happen. This is something that I've been studying now for the last year and a half, that there are entire industries now that have popped up that purport to speak for consumers. If any of you have gotten emails lately about the latest Apple software update and you're now in some class action lawsuit where you can get 65 cents, this is kind of what we're talking about. And unfortunately, that's what's going to happen in these kind of lawsuits if there is no liability waiver. There are going to be many circumstances where there are going to be large lawsuits targeted at both big and small companies, and that's going to affect prices for consumers. It means many of these companies and small enterprises are going to have to hire lawyers, bulk up their legal teams. Instead of focusing on PP&E, instead of making sure that their businesses or schools are safe for people to come, they're going to have to focus as well on the legal realm. And that's not necessarily good at all for you and me when we go buy products and go to the store. It's better when they can devote their resources to making their communities and their places safe, because then we know we can go back out. So that's sort of the argument that we've been making at Consumer Choice Center, trying to reach out mostly to younger millennials and make this message very well known, but also to different businesses, schools, companies, just to know that, you know, there is consumer concern that businesses in these places are following guidelines and providing a great space where people know they won't be at risk of catching the virus. And I think that is important. And responsible institutions that take those steps and take those measures, they should definitely not have to face the wrath of the very, very hungry legal movement, particularly the plaintiff lawyers that would like to sue a lot of these places into oblivion. It's not the vote of confidence we need when we're coming out of lockdown. And I think doing this, and hopefully we've got some movement on the Senate floor. We'll see what happens with that later today. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But, you know, when it comes to assigning blame, this is not something that you can just put down at your local brewery or your baker. You know, this is not going to be settled in the courts. This is a pandemic with public health consequences. And the more that we can focus on giving people some kind of measure of knowing that they can go safely back to their businesses, they can go back to work, they can go back to school, I think having a liability waiver for those responsible businesses and institutions is really integral to that. So I will yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
So I know there's a lot of points I think the panelists will probably want to discuss that each of you made, but just one quick question, and you guys can feel free to kind of take the discussion in whatever direction you'd like. But I'm wondering what, you know, when these do go to court, will this really hinge on like what the definition of responsible is under this statute? There's a lot that's really vague here. I mean, not even to get into the huge can of worms that's, you know, about the debate over what harm is, but it's really hard to define what responsible steps are in these scenarios.
Well, people have a duty of care toward people who go in hotels or go into restaurants. But this duty was formulated with different kinds of injuries. Somebody slips and falls, or they're served food that's bad and they get sick. This is a different kind of environment and danger. So the rules as to what a duty is owed are going to be formulated, and the common law is whatever courts want to make it up to be. But I'll just open the door. There has been efforts at the federal level, which Yael mentioned, of having a statute that would provide some protection. The problem there is that you have an irreducible force and an immovable object, because the trial lawyers control the House, strong control, contributed money, but they have great control there. So I don't see Pelosi folding on a liability issue. Maybe there'll be some compromise. At the state level, there's been some 18 state laws. They vary all over the place, but they modify the duty that I've talked about. So some of the statutes, as Karen adverted to, say if you follow X rules, and it's spelled out in the statute what the rules are, then you're not subject to liability unless somebody pulls or acts willfully toward a client or customer. So that's just a brief introduction of what the duty is of people in this completely new environment.
But if I could just add, that is a very important question, but my concern is in many respects, for the small business owner, it doesn't even matter. And the reason I say that is because it's so broad and undefined, anybody's going to be able to file a lawsuit. And just the fact that a lawsuit is filed or threatened is enough to really be very harmful for small business, because that means at a minimum they're going to have to pay for an attorney. More likely they're just going to write a check and try to make it all go away.
Yeah, and this harbors on, responsibility here. And that's why, we look to these institutions, because they're the ones that we go to. They're the restaurants, they are the small businesses. We go to these places and we have an expectation. And I think the responsible businesses have been following that, and they have a responsibility to do so. They are coming out from lockdown. Many of them have not been able to open up or to serve any customers, and now they are. And of course, they're going to follow the rules. And of course, they're going to follow the guidelines. And those who are negligent, perhaps there would be grounds there. I think many of the people who might be listening probably went somewhere on Labor Day and probably saw some places, I know I did, out at the lake, of people not following rules, and many businesses that kind of look the other way. And that's not necessarily the clarity that we kind of need. And it really falls back on the customer themselves, and then also the store. And the whatever it might be, school or business, they have a responsibility to provide that, not just because they want to follow the rules. Again, they want to serve their customers. They want to do right by the consumer. So as much as the guidelines are very, very helpful, we have to also recognize that there's a lot of responsibility at the feet of businesses and schools that are really just trying to please whoever their consumers or customers are.
Yes, but don't you see that as more of a clarity issue, as of them not taking enough steps? I mean, who knows what steps you're supposed to be taking in a lot of these scenarios? Another question I have is the interaction between these state laws that we see being passed and the federal laws. I mean, obviously the federal law would presumably preempt that, but is this something that is being better taken care of in some cases on the state level, or is that route kind of an impossibility?
Well, there's been very good. My colleague, Carrie Silverman at Chicory and Bacon, has probably done more in this area than anyone in the country. Laws have been enacted in about 17 states. They do provide protection. If there's common themes, it's to raise the burden of proof when you sue. So you have to prove gross negligence or recklessness. Mere negligence is not enough. They are limited in who they protect. They may protect premises where the premises has followed rules. They may protect people who make protective devices. They may protect healthcare workers who are acting in this field. Sometimes it's only voluntary people acting in this field. So there has been movement, and state by state it is helpful, because the federal level is a swamp. There hasn't been very much passed in the federal level in 20 years, because the trial lawyers, particularly now, have tremendous strength in the House. I mean, they're a legitimate lobbying group, and I spoke to one who I have great respect for. I said, well, what about a modest bill that encourages businesses to act safely? I mean, you want safety. And he said, you're right, but we don't want any precedent at the federal level that provides any protection for any business or any entity at any time. And this would be a precedent. I said, well, it's time limited. They said they don't care. It's a precedent. And so we are going to see a very strong fight at the federal level, which just leaves you to the states. And as Karen mentioned, the possibility of waivers, but they may be challenged, because under the law, a business cannot simply waive liability for its negligence. So there is some limit to what waivers can do.
Yeah, and I would say I've gone back and forth between a few jurisdictions, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and there are small differences in the way that they approach things. I think it's helpful that we do have a federal model that allows states to take a very large prerogative in this, and many states have done a fairly good job. I'm more familiar with as well what's happened in Europe, where a lot of people closed things down very early and provided incredibly clear guidelines. And that avoided the mishmash of perhaps lawsuits coming down the line, or people being upset, or mass movements against these types of measures. And between the states, again, there has been a following of the science and things that are coming from CDC. And because of that, I think it does provide, again, a lot of credibility. And I know that the legal issues are more up for Victor and Karen to discuss, but at least from a consumer perspective, knowing that these guidelines are somewhat streamlined, you're not going to have a huge difference between areas. Definitely a lot of things with the mandatory quarantines for people visiting states was a totally different level. There's definitely going to have to be a kind of reckoning as well to understand the power that many states have gone. And I outline New York as probably one of the most stringent, and a lot of things that they've done have actually been very harmful for business and for consumers, and it probably led to more disease, maybe more deaths. That's not sure, but I know there's going to be a lot of reporting on this, hopefully, and we can figure this all out in a few months. But right now, we don't really have time. And for the liability that's being discussed right now, Democrats have in the House and the Senate have obviously poo-pooed the idea. They say it's just liability for large corporations, but I really think it misses the point. This is about the everyday mom and pop retailer who is just trying to follow the rules. They've just been allowed to open, whereas many big box stores have been allowed to be open because they've been deemed essential. So would that not be another slap in the face to know that there's a huge risk of lawsuits coming down the pike? I think so. So I think it would be very interesting to see how this works out. Hopefully there will be a good vote today in the Senate. We'll see if maybe they can get their ducks in a row. Thankfully, I'm not a politician, but we'll see if they can do their jobs.
I'll just quickly mention one legal hurdle, and it's a mountain, and that's proving causation. If you fall in a business, or you eat bad food, or somebody injures you, causation is easy. But we all move around all the time. I wear a mask in my apartment house, but when I'm in an elevator, I feel a sense of danger. But if I got the disease, I can't really prove it happened in an elevator or in a lobby or somewhere else. And you have to prove by more probable than not causation. So I asked my plaintiff lawyer friends, and they are friends, how do you get around that? And I love the answer. It depends on the court. It depends on the court, not law. Some courts are going to be lenient in letting the causation issue go to the jury. And it may be speculative, but if the jury sees somebody there who's sick or a relative of somebody who died, there is a certain empathy factor, and causation may not be quite the hurdle that it would be. The other point is a broader one, and it goes beyond this issue, and that is how people think about responsibility. Is it my responsibility to wear a mask? Is it my responsibility to say, hey, 6 feet, stay 6 feet away? Or is it a small business's responsibility to go out of its way to protect me? Right now, it's informal. Most people think it is their own responsibility. It's not like suing Roundup where they say it's Roundup. But the trial lawyers, and I ask everyone listening, everyone watching, to watch for this in any medium. They are trying to change how people think. So they think differently. So they think that it is somebody else's responsibility for their harm. And that's not legal. That's how jurors think and people think.
No, and I would agree. First of all, on the point of causation and responsibility, I was just in a store recently, and it's got a big footprint, but they only had 2, people working there, probably the owner and a associate. And what my friend was walking around without a mask on. I had to remind them to put the mask on. But the footprint was so big, they would have never known because they're ringing up a customer and helping another customer with the 2 people that are there. So that is going to be a big deal. We have been very worried about some of these ordinances we're seeing in different communities across the country that are trying to make, as Victor says, the small business owner the mask police. And that is just not going to work. It's not tenable. And honestly, it's not fair. The one thing I'd say, again, we are very, we're hopeful that the legislation at the federal level will go through, but I recognize that is going to be a rough road in the House. But McConnell and Cornyn were careful to only set a floor so that states could go farther on tort reform, and so the preemption is not as robust as you would normally think there. And I think that was smart for them to do it that way. But again, as much as the patchwork is not ideal, it's at least better because you are at least seeing states move on this. I think, as more businesses open up, the more it's just going to have to happen for them to be able to get, back to the levels they were pre-pandemic.
And another,
go
ahead, Victor, sorry.
The opposition argument in this instance is interesting to me because it's not the same as when I have dealt with other tort reform measures. And it's Public Citizen, which is a strong group, taking the position of the trial lawyers at both the federal and state level. They're not saying people shouldn't be liable. They are saying it is not a problem. There's now about 3,600 lawsuits, but they say only a small percentage of them, very small, is for personal injury. And usually that's employee against employer. So Congress of the United States, State of Michigan, you shouldn't be dealing with this because it's not a problem. And that's their argument. At this time, there is not a thunderstorm or hailstorm of personal injury lawsuits. We're in the beginning, and I like what Karen said about asbestos. When that began, most of the lawsuits were lost in the beginning. So we're in the zygote phase. We're not even in the first month of these opportunities. If people win them, if the early tests bring about settlements, then you will see more done. But the argument now is it's not a problem. Over and over. That's where they are.
Yeah, it's problematic in many aspects as well. And again, we're more of a consumer advocacy group that's looking out for the consumers who like innovation. We have many disagreements with Public Citizen and their like, but it brings it back. And where you'll see this a lot, and where it is being articulated, is with the schools. And there's a huge debate on schools, school choice, people having to do Zoom at home for their kids, which I can only imagine what that's like. Sorry to all the young people who have to be going through this at this moment. But what we're going to do for our schools and what kind of liability we'll be placing there is also going to be very key for understanding how future legal battles will look. And many of these schools administrators are not just going out willy-nilly and opening it up and not thinking about anything. They're really taking precautions into account. And I think we have to recognize that. There are no bad actors that we know so far. Everyone is really just trying to go back to how it was in the past, but do so with responsible protections. And how it works out with the schools, how it works out with large-scale businesses, things like worker assembly lines, meatpacking plants, people who are assembling cars. We've already seen it with sports. I think that's given us a very good idea of how people have been very responsible. You look at the bubble for the NBA and the NHL and the MLS, all these major sports leagues, and NASCAR included, for those in the South, but they've taken these kind of precautions and they've done an immensely good job. And again, they didn't do it because they thought they'd get sued. They do it because they thought it was the right thing and they were following the guidelines. And I think if we're to just give a bit more trust to many people out there, that's kind of why we need to have a liability protection. We'll see what happens. I know there's some mutterings that might have already been voted down as we speak right now, but hopefully we can try to muster some action against that.
Yeah, so I see a chat from my friend and former colleague Alan Smith saying Senate Democrats blocked the vote just now on the bill we have been discussing, according to news reports. Any quick reactions?
Well, I can't say that I'm surprised, but I also am frustrated. I get that the trial bar controls the House. I get that. But I also think that all of these members have constituents, businesses in their districts that are in desperate need of this protection. I just don't understand why this one isn't different and people aren't viewing it differently, because it's just going to make it that much harder for this economy to come back with this threat over business owners across the country.
They sometimes associate trial lawyers with Democrats, but I would just make this note because it's going to happen here. There are Republicans who are in the Senate who are and will vote with the trial lawyers. They've, at least in my lifetime, which is a while, I know of no lobby that is more effective than the trial lawyers. They will have a senator's sister call. You don't see it. It's not letters. It's a personal phone call. You're going to hurt people by voting for this. You're going to be stigmatized. When you run again, we're going to say you trampled on victims' rights. And this can, and there's money. There is fundraising that is done for certain Republicans, and people can look that up, by the trial lawyers. So they have thought beyond a narrow circle. And again, to my surprise, I said, well, why don't you go along with something modest? You can look good. Why don't you do something about a frivolous claim that has no basis whatsoever and protect the small business? No, we don't want the precedent. And so what we have is state legislation. And some of it is pretty good. And it provides some protection without being horrific and protecting wrongdoers.
Yeah, I would be very, I would not be surprised to learn that now that we have this bill perhaps being blocked, that there are going to be a new round of lawsuits. And I'm sure many people here might subscribe to many of these newsletters that have sort of seen the cottage industry around this stuff. There's all kinds of stuff against companies that do hand sanitizer. In the beginning of the pandemic, we were all celebrating many of the distilleries that had actually pivoted and were offering now hand sanitizer, and that's been great. But now there's all these lawsuits against hand sanitizer companies. You can't help me protect from COVID, all these kind of things. And a lot of what I've seen more on the media side is people are reaching out, and you've already seen commercials as well. I think the panelists are very familiar with many of these commercials for legal firms and looking for the next class action participants who will join in their massive suit. And the other point to this, and both Victor and Karen mentioned this when it comes to the power of the lobby that's there in DC, which is unfortunate, is that you have most of these large cases, and this has to be spelled out. For many of the lawyers that are doing this, they get a huge cut and a huge percentage of these eventual rulings. So when you are an individual person and you join one of these lawsuits, many people might think they're joining for justice, but at the end, sometimes up to 75% go to the legal firms that initiated these claims or these lawsuits. And you're left with like your normal Apple lawsuits where you're going to get 63 cents or maybe $2. And all you're doing is creating bad precedents, as Victor said. I would hope that would not happen much, but definitely the cottage industry is there. The newsletters are very frequent. A lot of people are probably joining these in hopes of getting a good payday, but believe me, it's not going to work out.
One reform, that I think helps and is hard to pass is saying that a contingency fee, and I did plaintiff's work, that my fee is 1/3 of what the victims I represent get, not just the hours that I have worked and have it assessed. Because if it was fixed on what people actually get, they may actually have something that's worthwhile instead of a token. But there is a belief, when I wrote my paper, Trial Lawyer Greed in Time of Need, it was published by the Washington Legal Foundation. That was at the end of April. I had more scoff emails. Victor, you're dreaming, go back, be a professor, forget about it. But now it's going on, and Public Citizen, which is very different from your group, as you suggested, wants people to think it's not a problem, which is a very interesting tactic to me. This is not a problem, so therefore don't deal with it. Not that your position isn't just. It's very different. And by the time the lawsuits are filed and moved, you have a problem with retroactivity because there's problems with formulating laws after claims are brought. So if you don't move now, when the onslaught comes, your laws may not be upheld because they can't be retroactive. I mean, these women and men, they're both, they think like chess players. They think a number of moves out. And that's what they're doing now. And broadcasts like this help people understand what's going on, talk to their representatives at the state level, at the federal level, write things. Here is, I'll mention this very quickly. The trial lawyers have their own agenda in this election. There has not been one article until an op-ed I did last week saying what they want. And they do have a menu. I'll give just one. They want to be able to sue gun companies. And right now, there's the Protection of Lawful Arms and Commerce Act. And it says you can't stretch the tort law to sue a gun company that's followed the law. They want to repeal that. You can't find one story about it. So they go at night on little feet. And I like to put up flashlights. That's why I keep doing this stuff.
Yeah, I've not seen those stories either. I know it was always kind of muttered about, but it's good to know what the agenda is, so it can at least be fought tooth and nail. So, Victor, thank you so much for shining a light where we see misdeeds and injustice.
We have one question from the audience. I'd like to remind everyone, if you would like to send in a question, please go ahead and do that through Q&A. We have 18 minutes left here, and this question might have been partially already covered, but it is one of the panelists suggested that the federal government has been stagnant when it comes to helping small businesses in the wake of lawsuits. Why do they think this is the circumstance, since it seems to be a huge issue for businesses, especially small business owners?
Yeah, so unfortunately, as somebody that's represented small businesses for a number of years, almost 2 decades now, small business tends to be a great talking point for legislators of all stripes. But when it comes to actually providing the kind of relief that they're looking for, it's very rare that you get it. I mean, Victor knows we've worked for how many years, Victor, on that frivolous lawsuit, Lawsuit Abuse Reduction Act that is really targeted at helping the small business owner escape these frivolous lawsuits and sanction attorneys that bring them. But we cannot get it across the finish line. How is this possible? And it's just, I wish I knew. I don't, again, all of these people have small businesses in their districts. But, at the end of the day, is it because money, speaks louder than words? And they're the one constituency when you look at the small business versus the trial lawyers and or the bigger businesses that don't have those kinds of resources. And it's just unfortunate because, again, they're the ones that it's just like with the regulatory environment in the country. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and they're not paying these big $1 million payouts. First of all, they couldn't even afford that. But the $5, $10, even $1,500 settlements are killing them, because you talk to a small business owner, and I bet you'd find it would be hard to find somebody that hasn't written that check at some point, or at least known of a colleague that has.
Yeah, and from our part, there's been just a lot of dithering, and of course, it's a pandemic of epic proportions. There are not many jurisdictions that got it right from the get-go, and we're learning new things all of the time. And how are we expecting this to translate to local business owners and people who go to shops? There's an expectation that we're going to make every single business, every single school 100% COVID-free, and we just have to live in the reality that it's not going to be the case. We have to know that people are taking the right measures to avoid that risk, but the expectations that are there, I know that's not really what's fueling much of the partisan divide in DC, specifically on this bill. And, if there had been more talk of yet another relief payment out to many Americans, many of whom are still trying to get back to the job market, maybe it could have passed, maybe it could have held muster. I'm not sure. I hope there's a good amount of fire that's here on this webinar to a lot of congressional leaders to say that this is something that people really need. And one aspect that I mentioned in the very beginning that I wanted to harp on is just costs. We're always just thinking about big business, small business, all dollars and cents, but really it's going to mean stuff is going to be more expensive for you and I. So every time that we go to the store, because of all these protections that they put together, because of now the legal ramifications, if someone happens to perhaps get COVID in a certain area, now all products are going to be more expensive, and that will affect low-income people. It's going to affect people who usually are dependent on many of these stores just for ordinary products. And that's sort of another failure of what's happening right now in the Senate. And thankfully, as Victor stated, there are many state reforms that are being introduced. And I'd like to highlight a lot of those as well. So any of these that we can talk about on the radio or talk about in media, I think all the better, because we need good ideas right now. And hopefully we can shoot down the bad ideas too.
I think that raises a great point about cost too. I mean, continuing the example of the Apple store, no one's thinking, oh no, Apple's going to have to write a few more checks because of this. They look at these larger businesses and think, well, they can afford the liability costs, they can afford the litigation costs, and they're not thinking as much. It's a little bit, but there's also this other kind of undercurrent that I personally find really interesting, and that there's more and more of a movement. And although, the larger business lobby is obviously a lot stronger, there's also a movement against these larger companies in general coming from both sides of the aisle, where it's actually making it kind of hard to defend even them when they're, being sued for the same thing. What is the kind of the interplay there? Is that spilling over into this debate as well?
I mean, there's always an animus against many big companies, and you see that a lot with Amazon. And there's been a lot of focus in the news about Amazon workers, particularly in these warehouses and fulfillment centers. And it's just a big, easy red target, and that does not even take into consideration the fact that these fulfillment centers employ a lot of people. They've built 2 new ones out here in North Carolina, close to where I am, and they're giving jobs to people who basically have not been able to go to work because of the lockdowns. And to think that there's going to be even more of an animus against big companies, and you're right, Ashley, it is coming from both left and right. That there's something that's always out there. A lot of people who are just against certain types of innovation, or they just represent particular sector interests. I think that's kind of why we have a Senate and a House to try to debate that out and find coalitions. But there's definitely a huge red target on many large companies, without thinking that these are companies that employ hundreds of millions of people in the entire country. This is where a lot of people go to get their ordinary products. That's something else that I think most people are not really taking into consideration.
One aspect of this is there's 2 parts of the barn. Karen referred to this earlier, plaintiffs' lawyers. There's the big plaintiffs' lawyers who I have to deal with to protect the interests of my clients when they have done nothing wrong. But for small business, there's a part of the bar that brings claims that have no basis whatsoever. They're not looking for $1 million. They want $5,000, $10,000. They know that the small business cost of insurance is such that the insurer will force them to settle. And that may, unfortunately, be a target for small business now. The only thing I can think of is publicity to it. Again, my experience, it's a few years, the plaintiff's lawyers do best in the dark. If they're doing something and bringing a claim against a business that's been responsible, write about it. And Karen has the ways and means to help a business with that. The public is not going to like it. They want to be able to go to the restaurant. They don't want it to close over a junk lawsuit.
And we have one more. Oh, sorry, Karen. Were you?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay, sorry. I thought I interrupted someone there. We have one more question that we have time for. I think this is a good question. Can you discuss any helpful actions the executive branch has taken or ought to take? Do you think there is more they can do without Congress?
Governors in a number of states, including New York, have issued executive orders to provide some protection to healthcare workers. That's the principal one that I know about, either volunteer or healthcare workers that are specifically at risk for protecting people against COVID. Whether they have the power to do this is uncertain. It's likely to be challenged, but governors in a number of states have done so.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I feel like honestly, most of this really is going to have to, at the end of the day, come from the state and legislatures and Congress. And I don't know how much at the executive level can happen, and also something that they can do that will be sticky and not immediately be challenged in court, and therefore nothing anybody can rely on.
Yeah, and I think the main advantage of everything happening more in DC is that you're able to have, a huge blanket. We're able to get federal courts, and that brings up the question as well of insurance that Victor brought up. I mean, it's similar to many places where you've had a lot of protesting, you've had a lot of looting, and a lot of times it is kind of excused because it's assumed that insurance will just cover everything. But I can assume that the insurance companies and everyone there, they're all trying to scratch their heads, and I'm sure they've got millions of task forces and plenty of Zoom and think sessions where they're trying to understand how they can deal with many claims that might be brought up, and there might be a good amount that are bogus as well, and that'll probably be the subject of even more lawsuits. So if you can even have more clarity on insurance, that would also be good, because I think Victor brought up this example. If you're just trying to sue your neighbor because you went to the company barbecue or the community barbecue and somehow got COVID there, the assumption that there's insurance just kind of is like a buffer. It's like, oh, I'm not actually impacting this person. It's just going after the insurance to do whatever. Does that mean that every single person is therefore going to have to get some kind of COVID insurance for the rest of their lives everywhere they go? It's a terrible way to kind of craft any kind of system. It's a terrible way to respond to a pandemic. Where a lot of our public health authorities have maybe failed is probably adding a bit more clarity to that. But I can only assume with insurance, again, with many of the claims, many of the lawsuits, prices are going to go up, and it's you and me that are going to have to pay that.
And you raise a really good point. And one area to watch on this, and you're seeing it in the states in particular, well, because they actually are charged with this, is in workers' compensation. And, we've been spending most of our time talking about what if you go into a restaurant as a customer. But if you're an employee and you want to make the argument that you got COVID from going into work, we are already seeing many states say, we're going to presume that if you're going to work, you got it at work. And that is going to completely raise workers' compensation insurance rates, because now you're putting all these people on a workers' comp system that they otherwise would not have been on, and that's going to be another cost driver. California did just pass some legislation on this that tamped down what Governor Newsom had done here, and actually, I think it's not perfect, but it could have been. I mean, they definitely made his order better as far as this presumption. But that is something we're watching in all the states, because workers' comp rates, we already know unemployment insurance rates are going to probably go up as a result of this pandemic. I mean, all of these are pass-through costs to the consumer, bottom line. And we just have a lot of cost drivers right now, and not a lot of things that are helping the economy pick up.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Any closing thoughts?
My closing thought is this. This event, other events, need to form in the public mind and jurors that it isn't welcome for people to make profit over a pandemic. Who else is making profit over this pandemic? Lawsuit abuse should not be a vehicle for that, but it's going to be how people think about it. Is it their responsibility? Do they welcome this? Because if they don't, trial lawyers or plaintiffs' lawyers are very good at assessing jury reaction. And if their tests show that juries are not going to go with this, the number of lawsuits will not go up. And that's not tort reform.
Yeah, I would just say I would just encourage everybody on this call and that listens to it later, to talk to your state and federal legislatures about this. I really think liability protection is going to be key to getting us back to where we were pre-pandemic. And people need to understand how important this is, not just for the business owners, but for them and the cost that they're going to see and just our economy as a whole.
Yes, and for businesses and breweries and bars and all these places that are disappearing because they've been forced to shut down, it would again be a travesty to think that they would then have to shut down to pay for legal costs. We know many things about the American legal system. It's a very expensive rigmarole. There's a lot of players in the game, and there are going to be a lot of bogus lawsuits, and these are going to raise costs. They're generally going to lead to more mistrust when people are out and about, either going back to work or trying to purchase products, and that's not something that we need nor we want. I think having clarity, having some kind of liability shield for those who are responsible, those who aren't grossly negligent, I think is a very smart thing to do. I think hopefully there will be bipartisan consensus around this enough. Specifically, this is an election time, and it's election couple of months, so that's definitely tinging a lot of the comments of some of our politicians that'll be there, but it's kind of up to us to keep that pressure up because this is going to impact all of us. We hear about first wave, second wave of the virus, but we're not even thinking about the future calamities and tsunamis of these kind of lawsuits and price hikes that are going to affect everyday people, and it's going to make it harder to get back to normal rather than easier.
Thank you. And I think we're out of time here. I'd like to thank all the panelists for coming out today. I think this is a really great and obviously really timing discussion. One of the best time ones we've had, having this come out during the middle of the panel. We always put these on YouTube afterwards. I'm going to make sure that this one is posted as soon as possible, given the timeliness of this. And if anyone has any questions for me or for the panelists, go ahead and send me an email anytime about that. And I can also follow up with the video to all the attendees. And it will be online too on the Committee for Justice YouTube channel and on our website as well. You can reach me at abaker@committeeforjustice.org, and I can forward along any questions to panelists or any media inquiries or anything you may have. And thank you, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Victor.